Hey guys, picture this. You're tossed into a reed basket, bobbing down the Nile like a toddler's bathtub toy, while the water smells like rotten figs and the distant croak of angry hyenas. Before we set sail, smash that like button like Pharaoh's chariot into the desert, and drop a comment. The scorching sun baked the mud brick walls of Egypt, and the air trembled with the clatter of chariots and the scent of incense. A Hebrew mother cradled her newborn, its skin slick with the salty sweat of labor, and whispered a desperate prayer as she slipped a hollow reed basket into the murky Nile. She tipped the basket, letting the current swallow it like a secret courier, while the river's cool fingers lapped against the fragile wood. The reeds swayed, whispering like conspirators, and the basket bobbed toward the palace gardens, a tiny life adrift in a sea of power. In the distance, the distant chant of work slaves faded, leaving only the river's steady hymn, a lullaby for a future king. At dawn, Pharaoh's daughter, draped in alabaster linen and gold bangles that jingled like tiny bells, strolled along the garden's edge, her sandals slapping the stone path. She spotted the wicker cradle bobbing among the reeds, a floating mystery that smelled faintly of wet straw and baby oil. With a gasp that could rival a Netflix plot twist, she lifted the basket, cradling the infant as if he were the missing episode of a favorite series. A gift from the Nile, she declared, chuckling that even the gods must have a sense of humor, and whisked him into the palace where servants swarmed like paparazzi. The royal nursery erupted with silk blankets and lullabies, while the boy, unaware of his hidden heritage, cooed under a canopy of amber light, his future already tangled in palace intrigue. Hidden behind a curtain of reeds, Miriam, Moses's older sister, watched the scene unfold, her eyes sharp as a hawk's and her heart thudding like a drum in a marching band. She clenched her tiny fists, vowing silently to protect this unknown brother, even if it meant playing the world's most covert babysitter. The river's murmur became her secret oath, echoing the promise she whispered, "I'll keep you safe, even if the whole kingdom thinks you're a royal heir." As the princess cradled the baby, the irony tasted sweet, Egypt's fiercest champion being raised by the very house that would later try to crush his people. Miriam slipped back into the shadows, her laughter mixing with the reeds' rustle, a quiet reminder that destiny often hides in the most unexpected baskets. Moses grew up under the glitter of Egypt's palace, where silks brushed his skin and the Nile's perfume drifted through marble halls. He learned to read hieroglyphs like subtitles on a blockbuster, and to wield a scepter as if it were a Hollywood director's megaphone. Yet the whispers of his birth, he was a Hebrew, a baby rescued from a basket that floated like a rubber duck, clung to his mind like incense. One scorching afternoon he caught an Egyptian overseer slamming a Hebrew slave, the crack of the whip echoing like a bad DJ drop, and in a flash of fury, Moses smashed the man's head against the stone, blood splashing like spilled wine. Panic surged, the palace guards shouted, and Moses fled, swapping his royal robes for sand-covered sandals as he sprinted toward the horizon. The desert of Midian greeted him with a sun that blazed like a spotlight, turning the sand into a giant oven where every breath tasted of brimstone. He found refuge in the tent of Jethro, a priest merchant whose beard smelled of incense and goat milk, and was handed a staff that felt rough as a vintage leather guitar strap. The Hebrews were gone, but a flock of weary sheep awaited, their bleats forming a chorus that taught Moses patience, as he learned to count them like episodes of a binge-worthy series. Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, laughed at his clumsy attempts to herd, her eyes sparkling like desert stars, and soon they married, trading vows under a sky that smelled of frankincense and cactus juice. Moses swapped palace banquets for simple meals of flatbread and lentil stew, discovering that a shepherd's cloak was cozier than any silk gown. Nights in the camp crackled with firelight, and the wind whispered through the dunes, sounding oddly like a distant drumbeat from a far-off concert. As Moses guided his sheep across rocky ridges, the land seemed to speak in low rumblings, warning of hidden thorns and promising water like a secret plot twist. He felt the pulse of the earth under his boots, the grit of gravel between his toes, and realized that every rustle of grass was a line of dialogue he'd never heard in the palace. With Zipporah by his side, laughing at his solemn looks, he began to decode this rugged script, sensing that destiny was stitching its own sequel, one shepherd's stride at a time. The irony was palpable. The prince who once commanded armies now commanded a chorus of bleating goats, and the voice he sought was the very wind that had once carried Pharaoh's incense. Moses crouched among the sheep, the desert wind riffing through his beard like an old record player. The goats bleated, their hooves scratching the cracked stone, while the sun baked the sand to a crisp amber. He thought his biggest problem was keeping the flock from wandering into a cactus patch. Yet the horizon blinked, and a flame sprang up from a bush that refused to burn, painting the night with a ghostly orange. The sight pulled his heart like a magnet, and even the scent of sage and ash seemed to whisper his name. "Who?" Moses blurted, his voice cracking as if a camel had swallowed a marble. A voice, deep as thunder but warm as desert tea, answered from the smoke, "I am the God of your ancestors." The bush crackled, sending sparks that danced like fireflies at a rave, yet the leaves stayed green and unscorched. Moses, half terrified and half amused, imagined a cosmic Instagram filter that made everything glow without burning. He swallowed the sand-dry fear and stepped closer, feeling the heat kiss his skin like a mischievous lover. God handed Moses a resume of miracles, a staff that could turn into a serpent, a hand that could vomit plagues, and a tongue that could command a kingdom. "Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go," the deity urged, as if ordering a reluctant Uber driver to a hot messenger job. Moses balked, eyes darting to his worn sandals, muttering, I can barely keep these goats from escaping." The Almighty chuckled, sending a plume of ash that smelled like burnt incense and fresh rebellion, promising that doubts would melt like ice in the sun. With a reluctant grin, Moses accepted the mission, feeling the weight of a nation on his shoulders, as heavy as a sack of dated scrolls. Moses trudged back to the choking heat of Egypt, his staff clutched like a backstage pass to a divine rock concert. He stood before Pharaoh, whose crown glinted like a gaudy Instagram filter, and declared, "Let my people go," a line that would echo through every meme about stubborn rulers. The first plague splashed the sky with frogs, their wet bodies clattering against palace doors, while the scent of swamp turned the royal banquet into a stinky nightmare. Pharaoh laughed, swiping his scepter away as if shooing away a pesky fly, but the river turned to blood, so thick it smelled like iron and tasted like a bad steak. With each eye-watering, mud-caked step, the Israelites whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the ultimate mic drop on oppression. The next 9 judgments rolled in like a Netflix binge of catastrophe. Lice crawling through the palace hair, swarms of flies buzzing louder than a summer rave, and a pestilence that turned livestock into a morbid buffet for the desert scavengers. When the darkness fell, thick as theater curtains, the Egyptians groped around like actors who missed their cue, while the Israelites huddled together, tasting the bitter-sweet tang of hope. On the night of the final plague, the air hissed with the crackle of dying firstborns, and the homes of the Hebrews glowed with the glow of lamb blood, a gruesome but effective, "do not enter" sign. The Israelites scrambled to eat unleavened bread, the crusty, flat kind that felt like ancient pizza dough without the cheese, and they sang a raw, guttural hymn of freedom. That very evening they celebrated the first Passover, a feast that smelled of roasted lamb, herbs, and the unmistakable relief of not being a footnote in Pharaoh's tragedy. Morning found the Egyptian army marching like a clogged subway, chariots clanking and soldiers shouting, convinced they could recapture their runaway labor force. The Israelites, hearts thudding like war drums, ran toward the sea, glancing back at the relentless tide of armor and spears. Then the waters obeyed a command louder than any trumpet. They split, towering walls of liquid standing like giant crystal curtains, the salty spray tingling the air like a fresh splash of reality. The Israelites sprinted across the dry seabed, feeling sand gritty between their toes, while the Egyptian chariots barreled into the sudden flood, their metal groaning before vanishing with a thunderous splash. As the sea slammed shut behind them, the freed people gasped in a chorus of awe, their laughter mingling with the roar of the sea, proof that even the most stubborn tyrant can be drowned by a well-timed miracle. The Israelites trudged across scorching sands that glowed like an oven on low setting, their sandals kicking up clouds of grit that stuck to every crevice. Sunlight hammered their heads, while thirsty throats sang a chorus of whines louder than any desert wind. Then, like a cosmic food truck, manna fell from the sky in fine, flaky sheets that smelled faintly of honey and yesterday's laundry. The people scrambled, scooping the white dust into baskets, their fingers sticky with a texture that was part bread, part miracle. Even the camels seemed to mutter, "Did we sign up for a desert boot camp?" The cloud of fire that crowned Mount Sinai rose like a massive neon sign, crackling with a sound that made the rocks shudder. Moses climbed the smoky summit, his clothes clinging with sweat, and waited while thunder drummed a beat that could wake the dead. When the stone tablets appeared, they were slick and cold, etched with 10 simple, bold rules that sounded both like a divine cheat code and a parental lecture. The people gasped, half in awe, half wondering why the Almighty chose such a dramatic entrance instead of a subtle text message. With a mix of reverence and a hint of irony, the covenant was sealed, the desert echoing with the hiss of ancient drama. After the fire faded, Moses turned his gaze back to the wandering tribe, his voice rough from dust and determination, urging them to practice the new law like a rehearsal for a grand finale. The camp buzzed with the smell of roasted lamb and the rustle of tents, while children chased each other, pretending the tablets were superhero shields. Slowly, the nation stepped into discipline, learning to share water from a single rock that gurgled like an old sprinkler. The promise of a fertile land glimmered on the horizon, a green promise that felt like a movie trailer after a long indie film. With hearts tightened like a drum, they marched onward, ready to trade desert dust for the scent of wheat fields. Moses trudged across the cracked, sun-scorched dunes of Midian, his sandals blistered and his throat dry as sandpaper. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the echo of Egyptian drums and the distant cries of his people, replaying in his mind like a broken record. He guided a flock of restless goats, their bleats sounding like a broken karaoke track at a desert rave. The heat pressed on his shoulders like a heavyweight champion, and he wondered if even his old shepherd's staff could lift this burden. Yet he kept moving, half expecting a miracle and half expecting a mirage to hand him a cold drink. A sudden storm rolled in, dark clouds swirling like a villain's cape in a comic book, and the wind tore through the cliffs with a shriek that rattled the bones of the rock. Moses sprinted toward the jagged outcrops of Horeb, slipping on slick sand and muttering curses that would make a sailor blush. He huddled beneath a crevice, the stone walls cold and damp, the scent of ozone mixing with the iron tang of his own fear. Rain hammered his cloak, turning it into a soggy tapestry, while thunder drummed a beat that sounded oddly like a bass drop at a rave. The storm forced him into a cave of shadows, where the world outside felt as distant as a Wi-Fi signal in the desert. Just as he thought the tempest would never end, a flicker of orange fire erupted from a nearby bush, burning bright without consuming the leaves, like a LED sign that never runs out of battery. Moses froze, eyes widening as the flames danced, and a voice rolled out of the fire, deep and warm, asking the same question his own heart had whispered for years. The heat washed over him, smelling of pine sap and ancient incense, while the bush crackled like a popcorn machine on fast forward. He slipped a hand into his shepherd's coat, feeling the familiar wood of his staff, and realized the wilderness had just handed him a megaphone for destiny. With a nervous chuckle, he whispered, "Well, that's one way to get a hot inbox notification," and stepped forward to listen. The sky over the wilderness draped itself in bruised purple, the sun bleeding its last light into the dunes. Moses stood alone, a lone figure on a sea of sand that seemed to sigh beneath his boots. The wind curled around his cloak, carrying the faintest rustle, like old parchment being turned by an impatient librarian. His eyes traced the horizon, where shadows licked the sand and the night waited like an uninvited guest. In that moment, the desert felt both a stage and a courtroom, demanding a performance he hadn't rehearsed. A whisper slipped through the dry air, a murmur that sounded like a distant radio broadcast playing static and a forgotten hymn. Moses tilted his head, trying to catch the words, but the wind kept stealing them, as if the desert had a mischievous Wi-Fi that only dropped connection when you needed it most. Doubt curled in his gut like a desert viper, cold and uninvited, asking why a lone shepherd should care about a fire that refused to burn. The sand, gritty as coffee grounds, scratched his palms when he knelt, reminding him that even the ground was asking for a signature. He laughed, thin, rusty, at the irony of seeking a divine memo while the universe offered a sandpaper postcard. Night finally settled, thick and scented with ozone and the faint perfume of distant brine. Moses raised his staff, half expecting it to sprout a neon sign that said, "Here I am," but the only reply was the soft crackle of the wind through dry reeds. He wondered, with a hint of sarcasm, whether any grand purpose could rise from this lonely exile, or if the heavens were just playing an endless game of hide and seek. Then suddenly, the sand seemed to inhale, each grain vibrating like a whispered secret waiting to burst. In that trembling hush, Moses heard a voice, not a thunderous command but a gentle nudge, as if the desert itself said, "Your story just got a plot twist." Moses trudged through the searing Midianite desert, his sandals kicking up clouds of grit that smelled of sun-baked goatskin. Suddenly, a low-lying shrub erupted in a blaze that hissed louder than a summer grill, its orange tongues licking the night without ever turning the leaves to ash. The fire glowed like a neon sign in a forgotten city, casting flickering shadows on the sand that danced with a rhythm Moses could not ignore. His breath caught, half awe, half terror, as the heat pressed against his cheek like a stubborn lover refusing to leave. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the desert itself were waiting for the next act. Compelled by that impossible flame, Moses shuffled closer, his staff tapping a nervous percussion on the rocky ground. From the bush came a voice smoother than a Hollywood director's megaphone, yet it cut through the silence with the authority of an ancient king. It warned him, "Take off your sandals. You stand on holy ground," and Moses obeyed, feeling the sand suddenly feel like a plush carpet under his feet. The irony was palpable. A fire that refused to burn, a voice that refused to be ignored, and a shepherd suddenly cast as the lead in a divine reality TV show. Even the nearby vultures seemed to pause, as if they'd tuned into the most unlikely broadcast of the ages. When the voice finished, the bush's flames dimmed to a soft ember, leaving a lingering scent of frankincense and burnt cedar that clung to Moses' nostrils. He stood trembling, his heart thudding like a war drum, realizing he had just been summoned by a power that could light a bush without devouring it. The encounter turned the desert into a courtroom where the Almighty acted as both prosecutor and defender, and Moses became the reluctant witness. He chuckled nervously, thinking, "Great, just when I thought I'd survive a day without Wi-Fi, now I've got a cosmic selfie with flaming foliage." Yet the lingering heat reminded him that mystery burns brightest when it refuses to be tamed, and his journey was only just beginning. Moses trudges through the scorching Midian desert, his sandals kicking up dust that smells like burnt incense. He pauses beside a thicket that suddenly erupts in violet-orange flames, yet the bush itself refuses to crumble, its bark shimmering like a neon sign. The heat presses against his skin, making sweat bead on his forehead like tiny pearls of fear. From the blaze, a deep, resonant voice booms, cutting through the crackle of fire like a bass drop at a concert. Moses freezes, half expecting a divine Wi-Fi password to appear, his heart thudding like a war drum. The voice identifies itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, laying claim to a lineage older than Moses' own tangled beard. It orders him to march back to Egypt, to shake off the shackles of the Pharaoh and unleash a people who have been humming free at last for generations. Moses swallows a nervous laugh, picturing himself as a reluctant celebrity thrust onto a red carpet of plagues. Talk about an unwanted PR campaign. Fear claws at his gut, a cold, gritty sandpaper scraping his courage, yet the divine command feels like a spark striking tinder. The absurdity of a talking bush delivering a mission makes him grin wryly, even as the flames lick his boots, reminding him that destiny never comes with a safety net. With a sudden surge, Moses' terror shatters like a cracked amphora, spilling shards of doubt onto the desert floor. He steps forward, feeling the cool bite of the night air on his back while the fire still crackles, a rhythmic drumbeat urging him onward. The voice's promise wraps around him like a mantle of ember-woven cloth, warming his resolve and igniting a fire in his chest that outshines the bush itself. Moses lifts his staff, now feeling less like a wooden walking stick and more like a microphone for a divine podcast, ready to broadcast liberation. As the blaze fades, he hears the distant murmur of Israelite prayers, a chorus that will become his soundtrack as he strides toward Egypt, destiny blinking like a star-filled sky. Moses tugs the heavy staff like a backstage prop, the mountain wind still clinging to his cloak. The burning bush memory flickers behind his eyes, a ember whisper that the earth itself has promised freedom. He strides down the ridge, each footfall kicking up dust that smells of sage and sun-baked stone. The wilderness recedes, its jagged silhouettes turning to a pale watercolor as the horizon opens to the Nile's glow. Even the clouds seem to applaud, rolling in a slow, thunder-soft clap. Below, the Nile shimmers like a giant mirrored screen, reflecting the midday heat and the occasional gull's squawk. Moses wipes the sweat from his brow, feeling the gritty grit of sand sandwiched between his fingers, like crumbs from a stale bagel he'd never admit to eating. He watches a caravan of camels lumber past, their humps bobbing in a rhythm that could rival a boy band dance routine, if boy bands ever sang about desert logistics. The air is thick with the sweet rot of reeds and the acrid bite of mud, a sensory mashup that makes him half laugh at the drama of it all. He grips his staff tighter, knowing it now carries not just wood but the weight of a divine RSVP. At the riverbank, Pharaoh's palace looms like a gilded fortress straight out of a Spielberg epic, its marble walls glinting with the kind of arrogance only a ruler who thinks he's the ultimate boss can pull off. Moses steps forward, his voice steady, as if he were delivering a TED Talk to a crowd of stone statues, except the audience includes soldiers with polished shields that clang like cymbals. The Covenant crackles in the air, a palpable buzz that makes the sand under his sandals tremble, like a low-frequency bass drop at a concert. He flashes the staff, and the tip ignites with a flash brighter than any Hollywood blockbuster finale, forcing the sun to take a polite step back. The moment is both terrifying and oddly comic, as if the universe just handed him a superhero cape with Deliverer of Freedom, emblazoned in gold. The sun beats down on the Nile banks like a relentless drum, turning the dust into a choking veil that settles on the backs of the Israelites. Their hands are calloused from endless brick-making, their throats dry from the acrid scent of molten copper and the coppery taste of sweat. Every sunrise ushers a new quota from Pharaoh, a ruler who barks orders louder than a megaphone at a rock concert. The slaves huddle in cramped huts, listening to the clatter of sandals and the echo of more that never seems to end. Yet beneath the oppression, a low murmur of longing threads through the crowd, like an underground beat waiting to drop. Moses grew up in a palace draped with silks, his toys carved from cedar and his meals seasoned with honeyed figs, far from the mud-filled alleys of his kin. One afternoon, a servant slipped a scarred, leather-wrapped scroll into his hand, revealing a lineage marked by a burning bush, a tale that felt more like a superhero origin than a royal bedtime story. The palace guards, as stiff as marble statues, never noticed the flicker of shame in Moses' eyes when he saw his own people labor under the weight of Pharaoh's edicts. He fled into the desert, swapping gold-inlaid sandals for sandals of sand, and the wind kissed his scalp with a salty reminder of freedom. There, by a shimmering pool, his reflection showed a man torn between the crown's glitter and the ember of a forgotten promise. One dusk, a bush ignited without flame, crackling like a neon marquee that shouted, "Moses, you're on mute, listen up." The voice that rose from the flames sounded less like thunder and more like a director calling action, for a story that had been stuck on pause for centuries. God demanded Moses return, to confront a Pharaoh whose stubbornness matched a reality show judge refusing to hand over the trophy. Moses clutched his staff, feeling its rough bark like a microphone, ready to amplify a message of deliverance across Egypt's scorching stage. The first spark of hope flickered in the oppressed crowd, bright enough to make even the hottest sand blush with anticipation. Moses marched into Pharaoh's throne room, the air thick with incense and the sharp clack of papyrus scrolls. He stared at the golden mask of the king, which shone brighter than any superhero cape, and declared, "Let my people go, or the God of our fathers will strike you down." Pharaoh leaned back on his throne, arms crossed like a stubborn teenager refusing to clean his room, and scoffed, "Who is this God that scares me?" The palace walls seemed to echo with a low, ominous hum as Moses felt the pulse of a power unseen, while the courtiers whispered, eyes wide as if they'd seen a ghost. With a final, thunderous, "I will not," the king sealed his defiance, setting the stage for a showdown that would make even the most dramatic Netflix series look tame. The Nile turned into a rotting soup, its stench like a failed cheese experiment, and fish floated like soggy paper on a greasy pizza box. Next came a swarm of frogs that hopped into every bedroom, bathroom, and even the royal pantry, their croaks sounding suspiciously like tiny green emojis shouting, "Ribbit." When darkness fell, a thick black veil smothered the land, making even the fiercest desert fox feel like it was trapped in a blackout on a reality TV set. Flies swarmed in a buzzing cloud that tickled the nose until the Israelites could barely breathe, while the Egyptians swatted wildly as if playing an overcooked game of whack-a-mole. Each disaster hit harder than the last, turning Pharaoh's palace into a chaotic sequel of nature's revenge. and every plague forced the stubborn ruler to stare at the absurdity of his own stubbornness. As the plagues piled up, the Israelites gathered around the flickering campfire, the scent of ash and burnt offering mingling with the salty taste of tears on their lips. Their eyes, glazed with fear and hope, flicked toward the desert horizon, where a whisper of a promise floated like a meme waiting to go viral. Deliverance is on its way, just trust the unseen Wi-Fi of God. They sang low hymns, their voices rough as sandpaper, feeling the ground tremble under a rhythm that sounded like a distant drum line, the same beat that would soon part the Red Sea. When the final plague finally cracked Pharaoh's resolve, the great king fled like a bad internet connection, and the sea split, revealing a dry road that smelled of salty, fresh liberation. The people walked through, stepping on a riverbed that felt like cool marble underfoot, their laughter echoing across the water, finally tasting the sweet freedom they had been promised. The sun blazed like a furnace over the jagged dunes, turning the Red Sea's edge into a simmering skillet. Behind them, the Israelites huddled, eyes wide, clutching crumbling sandals as Pharaoh's chariots thundered like an angry rock concert. Mothers clutched infants, the scent of fear mingled with the salty tang of brine, and a lone goat bleated, as if mocking the impending doom. Moses stood firm, staff in hand, his beard bristling as if he just heard a bad pun from the Almighty. "We're not going to need a Netflix drama for this," he muttered, and the crowd's murmurs turned into a reluctant, hopeful chant. With a swift, almost theatrical swing, Moses raised his staff toward the roiling horizon. The waters shivered, then split apart as if a giant's hand sliced a cake, exposing a dry, dusty corridor that stretched like a runway for the desperate. Pebbles cracked under the sudden exposure, sending up puffs of dust that smelled of ancient earth and overdue laundry. The Egyptians froze, their iron helmets glinting, while the Israelites stared at the miracle like teenagers spotting a limited edition sneaker drop. A wind hissed through the newly formed walls, carrying whispers of "you made it" from the very stones themselves. The people surged forward, sand crunching beneath their feet, each step echoing like a drumbeat of redemption. Children laughed, splashing in shallow puddles that formed where the sea's belly had been, while an old carpenter muttered, "I always wanted a beach vacation." Behind them, the Egyptian army roared, their chariots sputtering as the water walls began to close, a tidal nope that drenched their ambitions. As the walls collapsed, the sea rushed back, swallowing the metal and mud, while a chorus of shouts rose from the Israelites, half triumph, half terrified. In that smoky, salty twilight, Moses turned his back to the sea, his eyes reflecting the fire of a nation reborn, and whispered, "Faith isn't a GPS, but it sure knows the way." The Israelites shuffled over the slick, moon-damp seabed, boots sucking at every step as the wind howled like an angry prophet. Their hearts thumped against their ribs, a drumbeat of fear and hope that made the sand tremble beneath them. On either side, towering walls of water rose like colossal glass curtains, glittering with foam and the scent of salty dread. Moses lifted his staff, and the crowd caught a glimpse of a faint golden glow that promised a way through the impossible. When the last foot left the shore, the sea performed its dramatic exit, crashing down with a roar that swallowed the sky and the Egyptian chariots in one massive gulp. The charioteers, red-coated and frantic, vanished like Instagram influencers after a bad live stream, gone in a splash of mud, metal, and shouted curses. The waters roared like a stadium crowd, slamming against the sand, then settled into a quiet, muddy plain where once proud war machines now lay rusted and humbled. Moses stood, staff still raised, as the sea turned from a raging beast into a temporary road, and the Israelites stared in stunned disbelief at the drowned proof of their deliverance. The Israelites stumbled forward onto the wet ground, their clothes soaked through, their sandals clinging like soggy socks, yet every breath tasted of triumph. Laughter erupted from the younger boys, their giggles echoing off the water-slick stones, while the elders whispered prayers that smelled of incense and brine. The sea, now a calm, muddy trench, became a strange, ironic runway for a people who had just escaped a flood of fury. As they marched away, the lingering scent of wet sand and the distant echo of collapsing waves reminded them that faith can turn the fiercest tides into a runway for miracles. With each footstep the sand slipped like gritty sugar beneath their sandals, the sea's brine still clinging to skin and hair. The people gathered on the far shore and burst into a hymn of gratitude that rumbled louder than a desert rock concert, drums thudding like distant thunder. Their voices carried the scent of burnt incense and sweat-soaked wool, a fragrant mix that drifted up to the lingering cloud. Even the youngest boy shouted, "We made it! No more swimming with the Pharaoh's TikTok followers." And the crowd roared in unison, the joy spilling as bright as sunrise over the water. Then the pillar of cloud rolled forward, unfurling a covenant as crisp as a scroll freshly inked on parchment. God promised to guide them with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day, essentially giving the Israelites the first ever divine GPS. He swore protection, vowing that no blade of iron or crocodile grin would breach their future camps, a promise that tasted as sweet as honey-spiced dates. The elders felt the weight of the oath in their bones, a solid thump like a drumbeat echoing through the campfire's crackle. In that moment, the desert seemed less hostile and more a stage set for a grand adventure. The memory of that sea-splitting sprint hardened into the cornerstone of their faith, replayed each year like a blockbuster sequel at Passover dinner tables. Families retell the story, eyes glittering, while children imagine walls of water parting like special effects in a Hollywood epic. Only this time the hero wore sandals, not a cape. Scars from the salty spray still pricked the backs of the older ones, a gritty reminder that deliverance never comes without a little mess. Yet the song of deliverance, echoing across generations, fuels a stubborn optimism that even the harshest desert can't erase. As they march toward the promised land, they carry that chorus in their hearts, a soundtrack louder than any modern playlist. The Israelite camp sprawls like a dusty quilt under a relentless sun that turns the desert sand into a scorching skillet. Voices rise in grumbles as the people hunt for a drop of water, their throats as dry as the cracked earth beneath their sandals. Children crawl through dunes that cling to their skin like gritty lint, while the older folk clutch their staff like a lifeline. Even the wind seems to whisper, "Do you really think the promised land has Wi-Fi?" Yet the promise of freedom keeps their feet shuffling forward, one weary step at a time. By the fourth day, the manna, those heavenly crackers, runs out, and the crowd's patience thins faster than a camel's hide in the heat. "We'd rather be back in Egypt," one voice shouts, echoing like a bad karaoke night around the campfire. Suddenly, a thick column of smoke curls up from a distant peak, rising like a giant incense stick that says, "Hey, I've got a plan." Moses, already half exhausted, hears a voice that sounds like a thunderclap mixed with a gentle sigh, summoning him to climb the mountain. With a sigh that could have been a sigh of relief or a sigh of dread, he straps his sandals and starts the trek, leaving the muttering mob behind. The ascent feels like climbing a colossal sandcastle, each step kicking up gritty clouds that sting his eyes and coat his robe. When Moses reaches the summit, the smoke thickens into a divine curtain, and a voice drops the ultimate mic drop. The 10 Commandments, chiseled on stone tablets heavier than his whole tribe's baggage. The words blaze with a scent of ozone and fresh figs, sealing a covenant that feels both terrifying and oddly comforting, like a warranty on a used chariot. Moses descends, tablets cradled like newborns, ready to deliver a new set of rules that will bind a people together. No more are we there yet. Just a firm, holy GPS for the journey ahead. Moses hoists his staff and begins the ascent up the sheer slab of Mount Sinai, the sun beating down like a spotlight on a stage. A gust of wind slams his cloak to the rock, and thunder rumbles as if the heavens were drumming a heavy metal solo. Sparks shoot from a crackling fire that hugs the summit, casting orange shadows that dance on his worn sandals. He pauses, breath fogging in the thin air, and jokes to himself that this feels more like a reality show challenge than a holy pilgrimage. The climb tests his muscles, his patience, and the limits of his ancient GPS, called faith. At the peak, a voice booms out of the cloud, deep and clear, reading the covenant like a cosmic contract on a giant stone tablet. Moses watches the holy tablets glow, their surface smoother than polished obsidian and brighter than a billionaire's smartphone screen. The voice promises protection, promise, and a set of rules that would make even the most meticulous HR manual blush. Moses nods, feeling the weight of law settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, and he swears an oath louder than any courtroom drama. He laughs inwardly, imagining the Israelites later scrolling through these commandments on a stone tablet. The descent is a slog through dust and regret, each step stirring up the scent of burnt incense and stale fear. Moses hears murmurs from the camp, people arguing over who stole the last loaf, like a sitcom's background chatter. Doubt gnaws at him. Can a flock that squabbles over crumbs truly carry a law carved by thunder? He chuckles at the irony, wondering if the tablets will get scratched by the same petty arguments they were meant to settle. Yet with each rocky footfall, he whispers the covenant into the wind, hoping the stone will mute the chatter and harden the hearts below. High on Mount Sinai, Moses vanished into a cloud of fire and thunder, leaving the Israelites shivering in the desert dusk. Back at the camp, the murmurs grew into a roar as the people stared at the empty sky, demanding a God they could actually see. Their patience thinned faster than a camel's sweat on a scorching day, and they started swapping stories like gossip at a desert market. Some grumbled that waiting for Moses was like waiting for a Netflix buffer in the middle of a sandstorm. Uneasy shadows stretched across the tents, and a restless energy crackled louder than the distant thunder. A nervous Aaron swept the camp with a silver tongue, promising a visible God if they handed over their golden jewelry. Soon the clink of bracelets and earrings filled the night air, a metallic chorus that melted into a bubbling cauldron. The heat sang off the molten gold, casting a sickly amber glow that painted the faces of the crowd in feverish hues. When the calf emerged, shapeless at first, then stubbornly proud, it stood like a glittering selfie stick of idol worship. A chorus of cheers rose, mixing with the acrid scent of incense and the sour tang of fear, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. At the summit, Moses descended, his cloak swirling like a storm cloud, his eyes blazing with a fury hotter than the furnace below. He stared at the golden calf and felt an instant nausea, as if the desert wind had turned into a punch of sour lemon. The people froze, their laughter dying on their lips, while the calf's surface reflected their trembling shadows. Moses raised his staff, his voice cracking like a thunderclap, and proclaimed that the covenant teetered on the edge of a broken stone. The camp shivered, caught between awe and dread, as the first true test of their promise ignited in the smoky air. Moses staggered down the mountain, his sand-caked sandals slapping the rocky path as the camp erupted in a low, frantic chorus. He found the golden calf gleaming in the desert sun, its bronze eyes reflecting the heat like a busted smartphone screen. With a roar louder than a thunderclap, he smashed the idol, sending shards scattering like confetti at a wild wedding. The people fell silent, eyes wide and guilty, while Moses fell to his knees and begged the heavens for mercy, his voice trembling like a busted microphone on stage. The wind carried his plea up the cliffs, mixing with the scent of incense and burnt oil, as the crowd waited for a verdict. Suddenly, the sky ripped open, and a new thunder rolled, deeper than a bass drop at a stadium concert. The Almighty's hand hovered over the stone, chipping it clean before engraving fresh letters that pulsed with a sapphire glow. Moses watched the tablets take shape, each stroke carving fire into the rock, the air smelling of ozone and freshly hewn marble. He felt a hum under his fingertips, like the low thrum of a vintage guitar amp, as the divine script settled into place. The camp gathered around, whispering in awe, while a few muttered that this was the ultimate reboot of their covenant. When the last command settled, the tablets glowed brighter than a sunrise over Jerusalem, casting long shadows that danced on the tent walls. The people stared, their faces lit by the holy light, feeling the weight of each word settle like a stone in their hearts. Moses lifted the tablets high, and the sound of crackling fire seemed to seal the promise, a contract with no fine print and no escape clause. A shiver ran through the crowd, the scent of incense now mingling with the crisp, smoky tang of destiny, as they swore loyalty to the unseen author of their story. In that moment, the covenant was not just a set of rules but a living, breathing pact that would echo through centuries, like a meme that never dies. The sun blazed down on the Sinai Plateau, turning the dust into a searing gold carpet that crackled under every footstep. Before them stood a massive slab of stone, its surface still wet with the ink of divine letters, smelling faintly of burnt incense and raw earth. The Israelites huddled together, their faces a tapestry of awe and terror, as Moses lifted his staff and cried, "We're officially on a lease with the Almighty, no late fees, but plenty of obligations." A low murmur rose from the crowd, a chorus of trembling voices swearing fidelity, while a few older men cracked jokes about God's new rule book being longer than any scroll they'd ever seen. The wind kicked up, scattering sand like confetti, and the stone seemed to pulse, as if the commandments themselves were breathing the same hot air. Moses circled the stone, sprinkling water from a sacred jar that hissed against the scorching stone like a soda can popped in the desert heat. He instructed the people to lay their hands on the tablets, feeling the rough edges, and to recite each command as a promise, turning solemn oath into a rhythmic chant, reminiscent of a stadium chant at a rock concert. The priests, draped in woven goat hair aprons, clanged bronze bells that sounded oddly like an old video game, level-up jingle, announcing the start of the covenant ritual. While some youths tried to sneak a selfie-style pose behind the tablets, Moses shot them a glare that could have melted the rock itself, reminding everyone that this was no Instagram filter. The whole scene crackled with incense, sandalwood, and a hint of goat cheese from the nearby camp, sealing the pact with scent and sound as much as with stone. With the tablets secured, the Israelites set off toward the promised horizon, the desert now feeling less like a barren wasteland, and more like an epic movie set waiting for its next scene. The law clanged in their minds like a metronome, guiding their steps through rocky passes, sandstorms, and the occasional mischievous desert fox that tried to steal a loaf of manna. Each night they gathered around communal fires, the flames licking the sky while elders recited the commandments, their voices steady as a bass line in a classic rock ballad. Ironically, the very rules that bound them also freed them, for in obeying the simple, stark edicts they discovered a fierce camaraderie that turned the grueling trek into a shared adventure worthy of a Netflix binge. As the silhouette of the promised land rose on the distant ridge, the people felt the weight of the stone lift, replaced by the electric thrill of a future finally within reach. The sun blazed over the wide, dust-kissed plains of Moab, turning the distant hills into a golden silhouette that seemed to whisper, "Almost there." Moses stood on a rise and raised his staff, the wooden pole glittering like a makeshift microphone for the restless crowd below. The tribes shuffled forward, sandals scuffing the cracked earth, while the wind carried the scent of goat milk and stale campfire ash. Elders in weathered robes leaned on their staffs, eyes flickering with a mix of pride and the nervous twitch of a teenager waiting for the next season premiere. Somewhere in the murmuring throng a child shouted, "Are we really going to get the promised land, or just a bigger desert?" A joke that lifted the tension like a sudden breeze. Moses ushered the elders to a stone circle, their faces lined like ancient maps that had charted 30 years of wandering. He glanced at the restless people, whose impatience crackled louder than the distant thunder that promised rain but also mud. "I'm about to hand over the reins," he announced, half serious, half like a CEO announcing his retirement on a Friday afternoon. "So start polishing those sandals for the next CEO's boardroom." The crowd's murmur rose, a chorus of hope and doubt, while the aroma of spiced lentil stew wafted from a nearby kettle, grounding the moment in everyday survival. A sudden gust tossed a stray scroll into the air, and everyone stopped to watch it tumble like a superhero cape caught in a windy downtown alley. With the promised land a breath away, a lush stretch of green that smelled of rain-kissed figs, Moses felt the weight of his final blessing settle on his shoulders. He raised his voice, and the words rolled across the plain like a rolling thunderclap, promising covenant, leadership, and a future as bright as a sunrise on a streaming platform's opening banner. The people listened, eyes glistening with tears, while the dust rose around them, turning the scene into a living tapestry of grit and grace. Moses' humor lingered in the air. "Remember, even if you stumble, the GPS of the Almighty never recalculates to reroute." As the sun dipped, casting long shadows that stretched toward Canaan, the tribe felt a collective heartbeat, hope thrumming louder than any drum, ready to step into the land that waited just beyond the horizon. Moses stood atop the cliff, his voice cracking like dry twine as he sketched the covenant's timeline on the wind. He reminded them of the sea's iron-cold spray that turned into a hallway of towering walls when their feet first touched the sand, a miracle that still smelled of salt and fear. He recounted the manna that fell like glittering dust, sweet as honey but with the texture of plaster, and the bitter taste of rebellion when the people demanded a steak instead of a miracle. Even the stone tablets, heavy as a boulder, carried etched promises that sang with thunder each time the desert sun hammered the camp. A wry grin cracked his weathered face, because if Hollywood ever needed a blockbuster about a man who split seas and then stared down a crowd of whiners, they'd have to hire him as the director. The Israelites shuffled, muttering like a disgruntled Instagram comment section, their sandals scuffing the gritty earth as doubt crept between the dunes. Old Aaron's beard twitched with irritation, while younger folks argued over who deserved the last bowl of stew, and the whole scene smelled of burnt incense and cheap soap. A heated exchange erupted near the water trough, where a man claimed the river had turned to milk, and another shouted that the only thing milky was the gossip spreading faster than desert wind. Moses felt the weight of their grievances like a sandbag tied to his staff, yet his eyes sparked with the same fire that had once turned a rock into a fountain of water. He laughed, a dry chuckle that cut through the tension, noting that even the most stubborn camel would move if promised a juicy date palm. With a steady hand, Moses lifted the bronze rod, its surface warm from the sun, and declared that the covenant was not a relic but a living promise stitched into their daily breath. He reminded them that leadership meant carrying the burden of the tablets while also shouldering the weight of their laughter, tears, and the occasional runaway goat. The crowd, muffled by the rustle of desert grasses, felt the heat settle like a blanket, yet a new resolve rose, bright as the sunrise over Mount Sinai. Moses whispered a final blessing, his voice rolling over the camp like distant thunder, promising that the seeds of this covenant would sprout even when the desert turned to ash. And as the sun slipped behind the plateau, the people clapped, not in triumph but in a gritty, honest applause that tasted of dust, sweat, and a sliver of hope that would outlast any stone. The desert stretched like a sun-bleached cinema screen, and Moses stood at its edge, his beard dusted with sand that whispered of 1,000 pilgrim steps. A sudden gust carried the Almighty's voice, a deep thrum that rattled the stones and reminded him of the first fire on Mount Sinai. In that trembling moment, Moses saw flashes of his own stubbornness, like a child refusing to hand over the remote, regretting the times he had shouted louder than necessary. He felt the weight of his staff, cold wood against his palm, as if it were a tired smartphone that had finally run out of battery. The vision folded back on itself, showing the future where his mantle would be passed on, leaving him to wonder whether a prophet can ever truly log off. The Israelites gathered around the campfire, the smoke curling like a gossip column, their faces lit by flickering orange that made their eyes look wide-eyed and wary. Their hearts hammered like drums in a marching band, fearing the unknown road ahead without Moses' steady cadence to keep them in step. A grumbler muttered that moving forward felt like a Netflix series without its favorite lead, and a few whispered jokes about Moses, the original GPS, finally needing a reboot. Yet the desert wind carried the scent of barley and promise, reminding them that hope could rise even from the prickly sand. As the murmurs swelled, a young shepherd boy lifted his voice, proclaiming that even a wandering flock learns to find its own pasture if the shepherd dares to step back. When the moment arrived, Moses climbed the ridge, his cloak rustling like old parchment, and raised his hand toward the heavens. He spoke a blessing that tasted of honey and iron, a blend of sweet hope and the harsh metal of duty that cut through the crowd's anxious chatter. May your steps be as sure as my staff, and may your doubts be as fleeting as a camel's shadow at noon, he declared, winking at the older men who thought his humor was a test. The audience felt a surge of wind that brushed their cheeks, as if the very breath of God was passing a secret note of reassurance. With a final chuckle, Moses turned away, his silhouette fading into the twilight, leaving behind a legacy that hummed like an ancient drumbeat, always there, even when the shepherd's song ends. The sun had barely slipped behind the dunes when Moses stepped onto the ridge of the camp, his staff glinting like a polished baseball bat under a desert spotlight. A thin plume of incense curled from the altar, mixing with the brine smell of the nearby sea and the ever-present dust that clung to every tunic. A chorus of murmurs rose from the Israelites, a gritty soundtrack of cracked sandals and rustling scrolls. With a grin that hinted at a secret punchline, Moses lifted the rod high, as if he were about to cue the finale of a blockbuster. The whole encampment fell into a hushed beat, waiting for the man who just split a mountain in half to drop his mic-like blessing. The words tumbled out, a rhythmic rap of hope, prosperity, and divine shield that rolled over the tents like thunder on a summer highway. May your crops burst forth like popcorn in a hot pan, he declared, and a few older women snorted, remembering the time the desert wind stole their last barley. Each syllable brushed the sand, leaving a faint electric taste on the tongue of every listener, while the campfire crackled, throwing sparks that danced like tiny fireworks. Above, the sky answered with a sudden gust that lifted the prayer flags, turning them into bright kites of promise. Even the grizzled scout, who usually sneered at any sentiment, felt a warm tickle in his chest, as if a hidden playlist of victorious anthems had started playing. When Moses lowered his staff, the echo lingered, rattling the metal of the water jars and the weary hearts alike, and the people sprang into motion like a crowd after a surprise concert drop. Young men sharpened their spears, women knotted fresh ropes, and the cooks tossed extra dates into the fire, their laughter rising over the smell of burnt oil. The blessing ignited a fierce, almost comic resolve. We're not just surviving. We're going to thrive like a meme that never dies, someone shouted, and the camp erupted in cheers. In that moment, leadership became contagious, a virus of optimism that spread faster than any desert plague. As the stars blinked awake, Moses stood back, his eyes twinkling, knowing that his final gift was not just words, but the unstoppable momentum of a people who finally believed they could turn sand into gold. Moses shuffled down the rocky spine of Sinai, the wind whistling through his beard like a tired saxophone solo. Each step kicked up dust that smelled of burnt incense and stale sandals, a reminder that the journey had been longer than a Netflix binge. He paused at the camp's edge, eyes blazing with the fire of his final blessing, while the Israelites stared, half in awe, half in the kind of nervous anticipation that follows a karaoke night gone wrong. The sun painted his cloak in gold, and the murmurs of the crowd rose like distant drums, echoing the thunderous commandments he'd just delivered. With a voice that cracked like an old vinyl record, Moses whispered the promise of hope, sealing his legacy in the very air they breathed. When Moses vanished into the horizon, a younger, eager Joshua stepped onto the makeshift podium, his sandals squeaking on the sand-strewn rocks like a teenage gamer's mouse clicks. He lifted his staff, and the crowd's nervous chatter turned into a low hum, as if the whole nation were tuning into a live concert where the lead singer had just left the stage. Joshua's eyes flickered with a mix of respect and the kind of swagger you get when you finally get the remote control after a marathon of buffering. He shouted a rallying cry that cut through the desert heat, promising that the promised land was just around the next dune, and the people answered with a roar louder than a stadium's wave. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The old prophet had taught them to trust the invisible. Now the new leader asked them to trust the very real, sun-baked path ahead. The tribe surged forward, sand clinging to their skins like gritty glitter, while the scent of frankincense and sweat mingled in a perfume no perfume maker would dare bottle. The sky cracked open with a chorus of gulls, their cries a soundtrack to the marching feet that sounded like drums in a marching band gone rogue. Every step toward Canaan pulsed with the memory of Moses' blessing, a whisper that lingered like the aftertaste of strong coffee on a sleepy morning. Children laughed, kicking up clouds of dust that glittered like tiny fireworks, while the elders clutched their staffs, eyes glinting with a mix of fear and fierce hope. In that moment, the desert became a launch pad, the old leader's words a launch code, and the nation rode the wind toward a future that smelled of fresh rain and promised adventure.